La tercera parte del evento.
Well, thank you very much. Now we have Claudio Aranzadi and the authors that will talk to us about the different chapters of the book. Please come to the stage. And I would also like to remind you that you still have time to send your questions in writing, either here or through the channel, the platform. Thank you very much.
Bueno, muy buenos días.
Good morning and welcome to a face-to-face session after 2 years in which we haven't been able to do it due to the unfortunate virus. We have mentioned many things in the previous talks. US talked about the 4 chapters that are part of this new edition. And here we have the authors. As well as Angela Wilkinson, that's also, she's in an interview every 3 years. We do an interview to someone relevant in the world of geostrategy and energy. And as you have followed the editions, you know that. So this year it was Angela Wilkinson, the Secretary General of the World Energy Council, that was interviewed for this publication, for this edition. This year we have 4 important chapters. Well, we have an article by the Chief Vice Almirant on choke points, the Vice Admiral, sorry. Then also Jennifer Winter, would like to thank her for being here in this session present, having to travel so far, about the emissions market and the international trade. Then another one by Alberto Pinedo, a chapter on cybersecurity. Even though Alberto Pinedo is not here, so we have Carlos Machado Martín, who's also collaborated closely in the drafting of this chapter on cybersecurity. Was also discussed 3 years ago in an article by Alberto Carabajo regarding the safety of the energy or security of the energy sector. In this case, we do a complementary analysis. And then finally, we have a joint article between Vicente Cortés and Benito Navarrete about CO2 capture, or CO2 capture, confinement, and use of CO2. Before, Íñigo Díaz de Espada said that something that's important to remember. This publication, this edition, was published before the beginning of the year, before the important event of the invasion in the Ukraine by Russia. This does not affect a lot the 4 chapters, which, because their nature goes beyond that specific situation, but it does affect the introduction that I wrote when we look at the most relevant events of the period between the 2 publications. Obviously, I don't talk about the war. There is an analysis about the tension in the markets, because this context, that situation of market tension and energy prices started in the last third of 2021. But the invasion has changed things dramatically. In fact, implicitly, in the introduction, I say that the probability of an invasion was low, we said. Obviously, I failed on that because, why? Because we thought that the threat of sanctions would deter Putin and the invasion, but that did not happen. So the advantage of getting it wrong is that, and I take full responsibility for that, is that many of us got it wrong, right? Many experts got it wrong. So, at least it's not that getting it, if it, many people get it wrong fixes anything. It doesn't. But at least there's that herd protection, and at least making sure that getting it wrong with the majority rather than minority is easier. And also the markets got it wrong, because if we looked at the prices of the term prices for energy in Europe, this just before the invasion, the price that it was listed in April was 24 megawatts hour. Why? Because all the analysts thought that the tension of prices in the second half of the year was due, obviously, the decrease of gas supply from Russia in the last quarter also helped to that, but it was not political. It was macroeconomic issues. It was to do with the COVID rebounds, also weather situations, etc. But that they said a perfect storm would go back to normal, and that therefore we would see a scenario of normal prices in the second half of the year. Obviously, that is not going to be the case, and I'm going to add to what's said in the introduction of the book that as a forecast it was totally wrong. Even if I didn't say explicitly, I said there was not going to be an invasion. I didn't say it explicitly, but implicitly I did. But the fact in itself is, from energy geopolitics, is a major event. Also because it shows something that, shows an inappropriate balance. Before, I think, someone talked about cost, security, availability. And in that dilemma, especially cost, security, that balance shows that was a balance that was inappropriate in the EU. It was more focused on cost. Why? Because the policy of gas dependency from Russia, within the gas pipeline, the cost was more reasonable from a cost perspective. The gas using of the gas through the pipeline from Russia, at least for the Eastern Europe and Mid Europe, it made more sense. It was better than bringing it from the US, plus the cost of gasification and liquefaction. What's happened? The assessment of the geopolitical risk of the attack by Russia was not expected. No one thought that they were going to take a step that would entail the risk not just of high prices, but also the risk of the break of supply, a stop on the supply physically. Another thing that we can consider to be not an appropriate strategy from Europe perspective is the traditional policy of connections between the Iberian Peninsula and the rest of Europe, both in the electricity sector but also in the gas sector. If we remember why the MidCat was stopped, it was because it wasn't profitable enough. Once again, the profitability security balance was shown not appropriately. Now the Commission has realized that was a mistake, and now when we look at the new infrastructures expected for in the Empower EU, we can see the huge mistake we made by not making the most of the storage capacity and gasification capacity that we have in Spain. As well as stating things that we didn't do we didn't forecast properly. Obviously, we can say that after the event has happened. I mean, no one can really thought that that was going to be the case. But obviously, the responsibilities are still there. But it's easier to see it now, after the event has happened, than to predict it. If we think about the forecast for the future, what are the main characteristics of the future, especially in Europe, in the energy sector? Well, I got it wrong before, so I'm not going to make forecasts and get it wrong again. But what can we say? Well, I think it's based on great uncertainty because it depends on the duration of the war conflict. The general already spoke about all the geopolitical scenario in which we are immersed. But there's also something very important, what the outcome will be. The war will not last forever. At some point, it will have to come to an end and reach some kind of agreement. It seems that the outcome will be a more deglobalized situation, as the general said, with greater decoupling. We don't know what's going to happen to China, but at least a greater decoupling of Russia, and also a new configuration of energy flows that will depend on how Russia fits into that new scenario that is more deglobalized and that will come true at the end of the conflict. And that's a major topic. Russia is the second exporter of oil, very close to the first, which is Saudi Arabia is the first exporter of gas. One thing that we tend to forget is that Russia is the first exporter, we could say, of conversion services and uranium enrichment in very high percentages, between 40 and 45% of the uranium enriched and of the nuclear process of many, many countries, not just Russia or the ex-USSR, but we're talking about Turkey and many other countries. Also, as Tony Brufa was talking about another important issue, which is critical minerals.
Nickel, aluminium, etc. So what was going to happen with Russia? If it's not even clear what's going to happen tomorrow. You know, the short term is uncertain and also the long term. You know, the sanctions have been increasing and there's lots of issues related to the embargo, related to oil and gas. You know, there's a problem for replacing it to stop the dependence, especially for Germany. It's true, and this has already been mentioned this morning, there's a European power called Repower EU, which has got a whole program of measures for energy saving, energy efficiency, renewables, to extend the life of nuclear power plants, green hydrogen, clean fuels. So there's also extraordinary measures like the decentralized contracts for gas. And these have been a few of the effects that is part of this project called Gas to Us. So there's a series of measures all are acceptable and very interesting too. But the objective of Repower EU is to replace 2/3 of the gas purchases from Russia before the winter. But some of these measures are really only for the medium and long-term effects. However, within this story and this uncertain future on the medium and long term, as we say, in this scenario that is uncertain, I think we still maintain certain issues that will not be changed on the long term. This is related to decarbonization policy and the energy transition policy. However, what has been shown by Repower and the measures that have been taken on the short term regarding prices is that the majority of the measures that are part of Repower EU are trying to accelerate the energy transition, but there are others that don't. Some of them, and that has been pointed out by the managing director of the Energy Institute, so the supply of oil will it go down due to the embargo? 2, 3, 4 million, which are estimations of barrels from Russia. And that will be compensated to a certain extent because everyone's forgotten Iran, but it's also important to take into account Iran because there was an agreement with Iran who can add 1 to 3 million barrels a day. At the end, what has been pointed out by the World Energy Council Spanish Committee is that there is a drive to obviously make sure that we don't have a lack of supply from Russia. We need to increase this new capacity which is based on the oil upstream issue. And this is part of the report based on the objective to have 2050 neutral emissions. But we shouldn't have any more upstream oils. In the Financial Times yesterday, there was an interview, or it's a sort of interview, with the first executive at Aramco, who said completely the opposite, said they're going to increase the upstream capacity by 2 or 3 million, and it will be necessary to increase the capacity of oil production to confront situations like the situation that we've seen this year with the increase in prices. So this has opened up an important debate. As Director General of Energy has said, we will be changing our route, the initial route for the energy transition, to now cover on the short term this possible situation of having a deficit, because if Russia will no longer be part of the energy market. And we have forgotten that on the long term, that the COP in Glasgow ended with certain commitments. The formal commitments of all the different countries, they represented certain objectives, related to the increase in the temperature in the planet. But some experts say, they need formal commitments, but obviously we need to study all the energy commitments and plans of each country. And it would mean that the temperature could go up by 2 degrees. So there's a gap between the implementation, which is obvious, not in ambition, but in the implementation. There's a commitment from all the countries to present new national energy plans and commitments. But obviously, with everything that's going on at the moment, it's very difficult to know what these plans are going to be like. And also the problem, the political problem related to all this context, so that the atmosphere of collaboration since the Paris Agreement could be affected negatively or due to the current context. I'm sorry, I think I've gone well over my time, so hopefully we can. I just wanted to obviously explain a little bit about the difference in what I wrote in the book and to the current situation. So anyway, I would just like to now mention the fact that the authors, obviously they can't offer a summary of their different chapters or their articles. It would make no sense because they've got very little time. But what can be done, I'm just going to ask them a couple of questions related to their articles so that they can give us a brief answer. So I think, Gonzalo, if you don't mind, let's start with you, to the Vice Admiral Gonzalo Sanz. So something that's not that well known for non-experts for these choke points. What is the role of the relationship between the international trade, and what is the current situation, the current relevance, and how can it change? Because we're going to have new energy flows and just and new technological changes. Thank you. Well, this is the main issue in my article. It's easy to see. If anyone sees a map, or you can see a satellite photo of the world, it's obvious that, it's like which is the blue. And as you see, Magallanes, when he went on that kind of boat, you can see this was his route. And this allows us to go over the world without any restrictions whatsoever. So this has meant that the oceans are now a source of wealth and relationship between all countries and areas in the world. So I think it's essential to understand that the maritime trade offers exchanges to an scale that is just unthinkable compared to other means. And these are the current pillars of globalization. Over more than 50,000 big, large-sized locks, on which 90% of our trade move around the world. But the maritime traffic is actually based on economics, because what they're looking for is efficiency. And that efficiency is the one that allowed the maritime trade ensure that China and Japan are actually flooding all markets with their products. So taking all that into account, you have to take into current transport is what is known as the intermodal transport, which is combining the maritime transport mainly with land transport, but also with air transport on occasions. So therefore, what is critical about these sea routes is that they connect infrastructures that are able to load and unload these large vessels very quickly, and that they connect in a very agile manner to the points where the consumption is needed and can be there are places where we can transport the energy. So today we can see how important it is to have the application of these different criteria in the Belt and Road in China, and also what Japan do in certain ports in the Indian Ocean. Well, as I've already said, maritime trade tries to be as cheap as possible because there's a lot of competition in the global world. And so therefore, the routes of these merchant vessels are almost stable. And they have to be as short as possible. So it means it's compulsory for them to go through, should we go natural routes or artificial channels. But there could be alternative routes, but that would make the transport a lot more expensive. And this is what we know as these choke points. Maybe in Spain we could just call them something else, but they're known as choke points. And these are where the concentration of the traffic, the maritime traffic, is higher than other places. So that in itself is something that's a true risk for the security of trade and global supply. What is most important, in my opinion, is to be able to guarantee the freedom and the security of navigation through these different straits and channels, because by doing that we can guarantee security of supply, both for the container traffic, raw materials, hydrocarbons, foodstuffs, etc. So the possibilities to limit the traffic or even to cut it off, because if we have a strait or a channel, they exist. And it's happened in the past. So lack of security in the world itself is often transferred to these maritime spaces and areas. And we all know that the Suez Canal or Hormuz or other straits are subject to a lot of different types of pressure. And this also happens with the Arctic routes, which are starting to open up, especially the route that goes from the northwest side. But I think what the most important thing is to understand, in the way we see things, everything seems to be guaranteed. And we see the future, quite calmly, should we say, but to a certain extent, our security, the security of our way of life, depends on the security of 10, 12, or 14 very narrow straits or channels all over the world. So it's very interesting for this to have been included in the national strategy that was approved in December 2021, which maintains the protection of the maritime routes and straits as something that is key to ensure European security and safety. Also, they mentioned the strategic implications that the opening up the Arctic routes could have, But there are also other choke points, even though it's different to what we're used to seeing. And they define that the risk for national security is a vulnerability of global maritime traffic and also the Spanish fishing fleet and the vulnerability of the energy when we talk about the hydrocarbon supply of next few years. And so in short, and what it says is that the maritime security in general, and that is maritime trade, is something that requires specific, constant attention to the possible risk. The main idea is that nothing in the oceans comes for free, except its existence and the opportunities for progress that they provide us with. But we're also obliged to protect our oceans, to guarantee their sustainability, and to conserve the right for free navigation, which is what all the viability of maritime trade is based on, and also the progress of relations and interrelation. I think this is a very essential part of this work. Well, thank you very much, Vicente. I would now like to give the floor to Jennifer Winter. I think everybody has their headsets on. So as I say, please, there's two-way interpretation, so please put on your headsets. You can hear either English or Spanish. Yes, Jennifer, I hope you've been understanding what's going on. So the question for Jennifer Winter is related to her article where she analyzes the different possibilities of putting a price on CO2, based on standards and command and control and the European system and taxes. All these systems related to putting a price on CO2 makes it more expensive. You can see fossil fuels, fossil energies, and for the final domestic consumers. But obviously, this is also important for industry. So many of these do not have the technology at the moment to replace the use of fossil fuels with a clean fuel, or even from the clean electricity when it does exist. These are the possible alternatives. What could you talk about the policies that could be set up to face this possible loss of competitiveness that could be derived in the case of European companies due to the policies in specific countries, because they don't have very strong decarbonization policies. So I think it's probably better, Jennifer, if you explain this rather than me. So what policies can be set up to confront this possible loss of competitiveness and the leak of carbon in European companies?
It's a pleasure to be here this morning. The issue of emissions and trade and competitiveness is a fairly complicated and contentious topic. And I want to ground my remarks today in the Paris Agreement and the commitments that developed and developing countries have made. And key in the discussion of emissions pricing and emissions and trade is Article 2 and the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities in terms of emissions reductions. And this is particularly relevant because it is the developed countries, North America, the European Union, that are the ones that have generally developed emissions pricing. Currently, it's quite low, and that has mitigated some of the competitiveness concerns. And so the real issue is that in implementing unilateral climate policy, and that can be explicit pricing or environmental regulations, there's a risk of economic activity leaving the implementing country for jurisdictions with less stringent environmental policy, which is referred to as emissions leakage. And the concern is the country with the more stringent environmental policy loses economic activity, and there's little or no real change in global emissions because of that economic activity leaving. And when we think about the risk of leakage, it's primarily to, say, developing countries, which are generally more emissions intensive in their production. And so this is the major concern of implementing these stringent environmental policies. And there are three main mechanisms for mitigating these competitiveness effects. One is to exempt certain domestic industries, and generally it's the ones at risk of leakage are emissions intensive and trade exposed. And so that means that they have their higher emissions per dollar of output, and they have limited ability to pass on the cost of these environmental regulations. So exemption is probably generally not a great policy because it's exempting the most emissions intensive part of the economy from environmental regulation. And so while it protects these industries from the competitiveness effects, it's not consistent with environmental obligations. The second option is domestic policy. So internal domestic policy to mitigate the emissions pricing costs. And this can come in a variety of ways. It could be subsidizing these industries based on output or a free allocation of emissions permits like the EU ETS does and Canada's output-based pricing system, or it could be subsidies and supports for emissions reductions at specific facilities and things like that. And then the third option, which is I think potentially the most contentious, is border carbon adjustments. And so that's moving pricing to the point of import, and it equalizes the price in the domestic market for those importers. And it's contentious because in a way it's imposing domestic policy on importers. And remember, the risk of leakage is to those countries that are more emissions intensive in production. And so it's again, potentially inconsistent with Article 2 of the Paris Agreement of that common but differentiated responsibility, because it's imposing domestic policies effectively on these suppliers. And the last point I want to make is, right now, we're not seeing much evidence of leakage. And I think there are a few reasons for that. One is that generally emissions prices are low right now. Most countries have emissions prices below $20 US per ton. The second reason is there are these domestic supports to prevent leakage. So it makes sense that in the presence of low carbon pricing and domestic policies to mitigate leakage, we're not seeing much evidence. And then, I'm sorry, my jet lag is getting to me. I can't remember the third reason that we're not seeing much evidence of leakage, but it does have a potential significant effect on moving forward as we have the parties to the Paris Agreement implementing increasingly stringent environmental policies, that there is the potential for leakage. And then these policies to mitigate leakage, it really gets into the issue of burden sharing and how much we want to rely on domestic policy versus something like border carbon adjustments in a way to incentivize global emissions reductions. Thank you.
Muchas gracias. Gracias, Jennifer. Pasamos ahora.
Thank you very much. We go now to the chapter on cybersecurity, geopolitics, and energy. Alberto couldn't come, but Carlos Machado is here. And he will talk on behalf of both of them. Carlos, I give you the floor. Well, what I wanted to talk about is, in a succinct manner, what are the main cyber threats that the energy companies should be attentive to, as well as the whole energy sector. In order to understand what bad actors we have behind, it's very important to put into context what is the technological strategy that the companies are using. And as you know, from a technological and processes point of view, there's decentralization, automation, digitization. This means that we talk about technologies that we know very well, such as the cloud, Internet of Things, analytics in all senses. And this linked a little bit to the nature of the energy companies themselves, which are key infrastructures or essential services providers, as well as the technology that we have in the sector. These are assets that we consider to be cyber-physical. There is a cyber attack that could lead to a physical impact. In fact, there have been several incidents recently, over the last few years, in which we are seeing this type of physical digital world element, especially in the current conflict that we are seeing in Russia and the Ukraine. And then from there, we want players with different motivations. One of them could be nation states, and the motivation could be espionage. Those are destruction vectors that try to cause as much damage to the opponent as possible, and even stealing intellectual property. I think that this is very much the case. We've seen it recently, but it's been happening for a while. We could go back to 2015, where a partial blackout in the Ukraine, where 250,000 people had no electricity for quite a few hours. So this is what type of players. This is very much increasing, this type of attacks, and with greater geopolitical tension, greater the possibility of having these attacks. Then we have cyber criminals, which are very present, which try to monetize with a return on investment, with a maximum ROI, their investments. And basically what we can see is that in the end they focused in the past in sectors that were much more profitable or enticing from a financial point of view, where the dots and the ones were money, were currency. However, they've seen that by capturing certain assets of energy sector companies, they can also compromise the national security, they can affect essential services, and therefore they're attacking them to such an extent that many of the IT programs that are known as malware or virus are already targeting those technologies, those operation services, those control services. And then we have a third block, which is, I'm not sure if it's least important, the least important, but it's also very important, which is hack activists. So basically they move activism into the cyber world. And basically what they aim to do is, well, to present an idea or claim something. And for the energy sector, I mean, all the people here know what can be what their claims may be, or the goals that they have. They want to have a reputational impact, mainly on the sector's companies. And what does this mean? That traditionally companies from the energy sector had a model very much based on the perimeter. From a communications network perspective, everything that was in industrial centers or CMDs or computational centers was totally protected, isolated. Because of that perimeter, there was no access allowed, and those technicians that work there had to be physically there to make any actions, to carry out any actions. However, over the last few years and with the different strategies of distribution, hybrid and remote access, it means that the perimeter has disappeared. Now we have remote access by employees, by technologists that work on industrial centers or in plants. We see electronic devices connecting between them and accessing the cloud. So we are not within the walls of a castle anymore. This has opened up. And this openness, which generates efficiencies, obviously, and optimizes the business, has important risks. And so we have greater possibilities of attack by the different players. So we have to try and do is to evolve in our controls in the past, which were very much targeted on the network control, or as little openness as possible. And now we have to focus in much more on the identity and the context of the users that access and what they access. If we are able to know who accesses, whether it's a machine or a human, makes no difference, and the context from where they're accessing, how they're accessing, if they're accessing from a country where we have presence or not, or that has no relationship to our business, let's say, that would help us, the context will help us to try and value the risk of that connection. And therefore we will decide on the actions that we want to do. We'll see whether there is a more robust or solid access required in order, rather than the normal username and password. And this is what many of the people here present have heard of, and the model of zero trust.
So basically, in general, that is what the panorama is reflecting in the current times. Well, to end, the two authors related to article on the capture, use, and confinement of CO2. Two questions, one for each of them. The first question, to what extent do you think that technology and the CO2 capture policy is essential to achieve the decarbonization objectives that were set up by the European community? Well, as we showed indirectly, we think it is essential for several different reasons, and I would just like to point out three. The first one is just that CO2 capture is the only alternative to decarbonization certain big industry effects. I'm talking about the cement industry. And the cement production, over 60% of the CO2 that they produce comes from the manufacturing process itself. It doesn't come from fossil fuel combustion. So the consequence is that there's 60% of CO2. To fight against it, we're going to have a capture of the CO2 that in their emissions. There may be others in other industry, but this, as we know, that the cement sector is very important, and they have a lot of emissions worldwide. I think it represents 8% of the CO2 worldwide. Secondly, I would like to highlight the fact that the CO2 capture technology is the only option for the artificial sinks for CO2 in the atmosphere. And this is the only option that allows us to achieve net and negative emissions. So whether it's indirectly through biomass, which is biomass combustion, gasification, fermentation, and then obviously capturing the CO2 produced, so we can get, a reduction in the CO2 in the atmosphere, or directly through the direct capture in the atmosphere, which is more difficult on a technical level, and especially on a financial level. And finally, the CO2 can be a perfect ally if it's a CO2 that's captured to achieve chemical products, and as you say, using the different fossils. So the combination of CO2 plus hydrogen to drive, for example, based on petrochemicals, this could become essential. And proof of this, the importance of the need of this alternative, is the fact that international bodies who are analyzing the climate, and also they're experts in climate change or energy agencies, in the majority of the different scenarios that control the temperature of the climate, which should be to maintain it below this 1.5 or 2% increase in temperature. So this means that they need to make an improvement in the CO2 capture by 20%. Okay, thank you very much. And the last question is now related to capture and confinement of CO2, but related to how important it is to have the technology and to do away with energy dependency and on Russia. Well, firstly, thank you very much for having to ask me to contribute in the publication and to be here today. The Repower EU has something that's very specific, which is to promote the production of hydrogen and importing hydrogen, 10 million tons in 2020, and we have to by 2030, we need to import this. And making reference to what the president of Repsol said, we're going to change, apart from the need to import critical materials, but also we're going to have to need to import hydrogen. So we'll have to ensure that we have security of supply. So we want millions of tons a year of hydrogen needs to be imported. And renewables will have to be transported 3,000 kilometers, but there's no ammonia or ethanol. So hydrogen has unique properties, taking into account its transport and its energy density as far as volume is concerned. So therefore, with hydrogen, we cannot replace all the natural gas, all the oil products, derivative oil products, but we need two types of fuels, which are related to the renewables, which are renewable fuels, which are not from biological sources, and the non-recycled carbon sources. So obviously, in the time available, and we're talking about ammonia, methanol, and synthetic fuels. For all of these, especially ammonia, needs CO2. So to combine that with hydrogen in a process that will end up providing with the products we need. So where does the CO2 have to come from so that the resulting product is renewable? The Commission says there are three sources. One, CO2 from the biomass combustion. Two, CO2 from an industrial origin that isn't based on fossil fuels, but there's not a lot of that, but some does exist. And three, which is quite surprising, direct capturing it in the air. The committee in the European Parliament last week, they're trying to ban the ones that come from synthetic resources. And also, I didn't understand when it says it's related to air and water, but I'm afraid I didn't actually understand what was being said at the European Union. But anyway, going back to them, with hydrogen is not essential for everything. It needs liquid fuels to transport it and to make sure it's suitable for the current infrastructure. For that, it needs CO2, and that CO2 comes from the three sources. And for that, we need carbon capture. And also, we need to do away with gas and oil from Russia. We need to have CO2 capture to combine it with renewables to get products which have got a carbon footprint that is in line with what has been envisaged. And that's it. Thank you very much. Well, okay. Now let's go to the floor to see if anybody has any question. We've tried to group the questions together We have a series of questions, some of them specifically for you, admirals, and others are not for anyway, which refer to the NATO meeting, the possible joining of Sweden and Finland. What do you expect from this NATO summit that's going to be held in Madrid? That's one question. And then there are other questions, but let's start with that one. Let's start with a question related to NATO. Well, I was actually going to pass this to somebody else, to Mr. Almirante Núñez, who is actually more related to those issues, but from the standpoint, well, the more military standpoint, should we say, what we do know and what we do expect is that there will be approval of a new strategic concept for the NATO, because the current one's been going since 2010, after the Berlin Wall fell. So instead of being faced on collective defense, now we're going to be a little bit more of how to manage crisis. And so this means that, which we talk about, issues that happen outside the NATO area, like Pakistan and areas in the world, like also taking into account Afghanistan. So change of the world order has now brought onto the scene the issue related to collective defense. And we expect that this new strategic concept, I don't know the document, but I do know the changes of opinion that have taken place. So we think collective defense is now going to be the core issue to give reason to actually having a NATO. Not necessarily focused directly on Russia, because, we will, obviously one of the NATO alliances is still to be against international terrorism. But I think now what we've been talking about today, about the main points related to I said there's a lot of terrorist activities, especially in the Malacca Straits, and this are related to our choke points. So I just don't think I need to add anything else. Yes, can you hear me? Yes, I think Gonzalo has answered perfectly well. So what do we expect from this summit? Well, we're working on the, obviously, documents. What do we expect? Well, it's going to be a meeting point and an opening point. And we want to build bridges and work with other instruments, but we don't want it to be closed off institution, because we don't want it to be a world of exclusive people, because a lot of people on the outside as if they are citizens of a second division world. So it's important to get back the spirit of Madrid in '97, where after the Madrid summit, the NATO opened up to countries in the east. So Sweden and Finland, it's very important for them to join, and also it's important to consolidate them uniting with countries in the Pacific side of the world. So we're not just talking we want about a new Cold War against Russia. Obviously, it's going to be very difficult to do this. But what we want to do is offer some sort of hope in our reflection. So there's something that started with the reflection of NATO 2030, which is very archetypal against, collective defense and using dissuasion, should we say. So then we have a second draft now, and we were talking last week, in fact, in Washington with the Secretary of Defense of the United States, and today with the Secretary of State for Defense in England. Now we want to go into greater depth of dissuasion of this collective defense. But it's not just east-west. I think it needs to be 360 degree, and it's fueled. Obviously, each country has to provide its arguments. There's the northern European countries, but that compares like Russia, and then we have Africa. So all these issues need to be taken into account. So on the one hand, we need to have this issue related to the strength towards the east, and I think our strength needs to be seen worldwide. But also what we want to do is open up the dimension of the cooperative Cybersecurity, which is NATO, is a bit more European Union, but it is starting to build a bridge, and we need to try to promote the fact we want people to become members, because obviously we can see the influence of Spain. There's a lot of pressures on the fact that we want the European leaders to come here, and it also has a character related to it being a priority partner, and we want to be more open, and we want to be an instrument that's useful for safety and security. I don't want to go into different fragmentations, say, well, now because of the war, the crisis caused by the war, we're seeing that it just wants to be a closed shop. No. I think there are more, obviously, a few hurdles along the way, but some of them, in fact, actually, maybe they could be, they're not actually hurdles. I think they're opportunities, because I think the situation around us, we can see that there's been, well, we've been going, should we say, going backwards. Things sort of happened in Latin America, the American continent, which has gone through all the different sort of fractioned entities. Everything's very polarized because people can win elections by 50 or 51 versus 40, and there's two social models that are completely the opposite. So, and everything related, because of internet, everything is highly polarized. So because we've managed to include these little diamonds related to the transformation of building bridges and including the interoperability of the military, and also that obviously in those countries the armed forces have the power to try and transform the countries, and I think that is very important. And also in Africa and Latin America too, with the importance that will be given to women. The equality of women, we often do not understand that when we take soldiers to a mission, the fact that there is a possibility of contacting with 50% of the population. If you don't have women soldiers, you cannot contact with these women. It doesn't exist at all. So this situation, these countries which are, stuck in their old-fashioned ways. So we need, we need peace and security, safe schools for children, but not safe schools because they're protected by the military. No. Children can develop, their future, which allows us from a strategic standpoint, and we need to look at the situation in Europe, the war in Ukraine, but we also want to look further afield. Well, thank you very much. Let's continue with the questions. Jennifer Winter, the question for you refers to the future context of energy leaks that you talked about, and also the low prices when you talked about 20 euros megawatt hour. But we're in Europe with different prices. Well, we're talking about dollars ton of CO2. In Europe, we're around 80. So what are the predictions that are done is that in 2030, I think we're going to be around 200, if I can remember correctly from memory. Do you think that, well, actually the question is, what do you think about the evolution? Do you think something could be done to control the prices? And I would also actually ask my own personal question, if you don't mind. Now in Europe, we have decided, in my opinion, by mistake of course, when we're talking about the cap and trade system, that's really confused with taxes. So when we're talking about the CO2 price, that for a long time was around $5 a ton, and now it's going up to 80, and then in the future it'll be at 200. Well, obviously we can't change exactly the system unless we get a unanimous agreement between all countries. So we've got to follow the cap and trade system. So even though this is supposed to be more efficient, but in practice, the price of the CO2 obviously isn't correct, because they are in effect for 20 or 30 years. So is it possible to do something similar as what the British did? The British had a floor for the CO2 price added to the maintenance of the markets of the emissions in Europe. So they had a cap on this, which allowed to have a reasonable price margin on the medium and long term, so that it will be a lot more stable for investments. I don't know what problems this would bring up for the European Union, apart from changing the internal system, which should be impossible. So, Jennifer, what do you think about this?
Thank you. So there's a lot to unpack there. I think to start with, I'll talk about the trade-offs associated with an explicit carbon price, like a tax that we have in Canada, mostly. Most provinces in Canada, and an emissions trading system. So it's a real trade-off between price certainty and quantity certainty is sort of the basics of it, in that with a tax system, you've got a clear price signal, and that allows for investment certainty and major decisions like technologies like CCUS and things like that is, all right, they know what the price is. The issue is that the emissions reductions are uncertain with that price signal because it depends on the emissions intensity of specific facilities and the technologies available and the substitution options for businesses and households. And so we don't know with certainty what the emissions reductions are. I mean, we have like modeling exercises to predict what it is, but that's a real challenge with the explicit price signal, is the uncertainty about whether or not countries can, say, meet their net zero commitments with a given price path. The benefit of an emissions trading system or a cap and trade system is that you have that quantity certainty. So you have a cap on emissions, and that's going to be increasingly stringent over time. And so you have that certainty around what emissions reductions will look like. The trade-off is the price is determined by the emissions trading system. And so that creates uncertainty for businesses. And I think it's also relevant for when thinking about the border carbon adjustments and the European Commission proposal, because the border carbon adjustment is going to be linked to the ETS price. And so that also creates uncertainty for European Union, the third countries trading with the European Union, in that they don't know what price they will face. And so that creates some really interesting and difficult incentives for emissions reductions in third countries. And then layer on top of that the adjustments that are proposed to be in place for prices in third countries also makes it complicated. And then I'm not sure how many layers we're at yet, but another layer of complexity is, say, countries like Canada, where there are these domestic policies to mitigate the costs of carbon pricing on emissions-intensive and trade-exposed sectors. So how does that price adjustment for carbon pricing at the border take into account both the emissions price in the third country and then any sort of domestic policy present that mitigates the cost? So it really is a very complex issue, and I think one that is going to be subject to a lot of negotiation when you think about looking out to the future. We do have a commitment in the European Union and Canada to have an increasingly stringent explicit price in the case of Canada and implicit price with the increasing cap on emissions for the EU ETS. But it's really, those are the countries that have committed to this increasingly stringent environmental action. The US, it's really not clear how they're going to go about it. And so that creates the real risk for leakage. And I think it's going to be a major issue going forward, just because we have unilateral action on a set of actors, which are actually right now at most risk for leakage. It's Canada and the European Union. And so that means, any sort of agreement around border carbon adjustment or pricing will need to resolve these massive differences in both pricing and economic activity. And it'll be really fascinating to watch from an academic perspective. I don't envy the people who are actually figuring this out and making policy in government because of the complex nature of it.
Gracias, Jennifer. ¿Tú querías, Benito?
Thank you. Did you want to make a comment? Yes, it goes in line with the question. The price of CO2 will continue to increase, but it will continue to increase the specific price. These are CO2 emissions for the emission rights in the EU, and they will go from it'll be at 4%, so therefore the prices will go up. But then what's important in terms of capturing is that at those prices, they'll come to a point when it's more competitive. Because it could be $100, $120 per ton. So the countries in the north of Europe that have the availability to transport and storage in the territorial waters of Norway, that have experience doing it, well, they are in a wonderful position because from a safety perspective of the business, those prices have been agreed. Therefore, I know that capturing and storing CO2 is going to cost me 75 euros per ton today. Tomorrow less because of the learning curve.
Well, I'm going to make the most of asking now, what is the CO2 price that makes the capture competitive, for example? Well, it could happen even in a gas power plant. And why, despite everything? Well, we've had moments when I think it was 80 euros a ton, but I think also there have been times when it's gone up to 100. So why is it taking such a long time to get these plants, these power plants, on a commercial side that includes CO2 if the expectations, unless of course there's not a mistake, is around 200 in the future? Because obviously, well, they are. You know, on these smaller sized, yes, we've got 4 projects that have been given permission from Antwerp and Rotterdam Port and from Wilhelmshaven to Equinor in Norway. And these projects have been passed and they will be up and running in 2025 or 2028 to transport these prices. Well, it depends where the CO2 comes from. CO2, which is based on ethane in the Antwerp port. So ethylene, which is 80% pure, well, capture, I think it costs like $35. Transport depends who transport, and the storage, well, it depends what the Norwegians are going to charge. Well, now maybe 50 euros in total, 60 or 70. So that's, well, let me just make, well, the question is very specific for you two. You made a reference to a different speed of implementing to CO2 capture and confinement between the north and the south. Can this affect the competitiveness of the industries in these 2 different areas? Of course. The industry in North Europe has the ability to eliminate their CO2 because they have got processes. What happens in South Europe? There's very few initiatives. There is one that's just starting out, which was started by Repsol in South France, but it's still got a long way to go before it's up and running. In North Europe, Equinor have the technology, and they have everything ready to inject it because they've been doing it since the year 2012. But this is a very important thing for South Europe. In Algiers, they have got depleted gas fields, but they have got technology to store CO2. So this could cause some sort of disruption between where the adjustment on the borders is worrying, because it means that the products are going to come from Algiers without CO2 because it's been captured and stored there. So there could be a paradox that we pay in Algiers for products that are combined with CO2, and then we have to pay it somewhere else because the carbon pays when it comes in, it's paid when it goes out. This is a scenario that I see that could happen in South Europe, because obviously to capture CO2 in Algeciras or in Bilbao and to transport it to Norway, has a cost that you have to add to all these other figures that we were talking. And then, of course, we have the competitiveness to take into account. For Carlos Manchado, there's a very specific question for you. You were talking about cyber threats. Who are involved in this sort of market, and how does it work, or how does it happen? I have no idea about the cyber world. Well, there is a market for a long time now, and not just a market, there is a whole network set up. There are these criminal bands that exist in the physical world and in the cyber world. We can talk about cartels. It's like an industry in itself, in which specific players develop, these badware, which could damage and damage our technological assets. And there are other groups or other gangs who get access into certain companies. Even they can specify on sectors, the energy sector, the finance sector, or wherever. And also there are other members. So what they do, I'm simplifying a lot, they make the most of suppliers to buy accesses on the one hand, and then also what they're going to, should we detonate there? We're talking about cybernetic terms, of course. And they just make the most of these two suppliers to monetize the activity that they're going to do. So it's a very broad market. It doesn't only affect companies in this sector. We also talk about, spying. Have we seen the Pegasus affair? And also, it's been seen in many other events, which we haven't seen in the press, but they've been taking place, I don't know, I could dare even to say since 10, 12, 15 years approx. Normally, this type of players, they're very related to certain governments, and sometimes that they're shielded by them. And it's not me that just says this, but this is documents. So sometimes the nation state that is behind them, they have certain interests created, so they allow them, or this illegal system, to be working. They change certain business models to a way that it can benefit them. Well, thank you very much. Well, there are two questions that are directly for me, because it's a very controversial issue, but they are related to if we have to continue the idea of the European taxonomy that includes nuclear energy, and to continue the recommendations, or should we say, what would be the position to adopt, take into account a nuclear energy in Spain, where 3 or 4 gigawatts will no longer be produced before 2030. So this is my personal opinion. First of all, I just say we have to separate what is an investment in new nuclear power plants, which are third-generation power plants, from the extension of the second-generation nuclear power plants. There are two completely different issues. My opinion is that, the third-generation nuclear power plant, it makes no sense whatsoever that Spain invests in them. You just have to see the experience in the UK, which they have to apply a price of, I don't know, for 35 or 90 pounds gigawatt hour, and then you have to apply to the Flammable plant in France, so it will be profitable. So obviously the French have said that when you get the first of a kind reactors, which were in the budget, and obviously we have to take into account the construction time, so an average cost of level of cost of around 70-75 euros megawatt. Well, taking into account that is true, we would have to leave you know, those that are really interested in it, they really have to say they are interested. Of course, we have the Chinese, who have a possibility of having a learning curve because they've got a great nuclear program, and so maybe they could reduce these prices. But at 75 euros megawatt, the difference with including renewables is so great that it makes no sense whatsoever. So what happens with extending the life of the current nuclear power plant? That depends on several things. One, if we decide, as happened in Spain or in Germany, that the perception of the nuclear accident or the risk for future generations for the management of the waste, the nuclear waste, because there's a lot of highly active waste. Well, decisions need to be made, but it's true to say that maybe with a transmutation, at the moment, well, there's been no decisions. If there would be a political decision that said it's not acceptable, well, what can we do? Which is the German case or the Spanish case? There are in other countries, there are other incentives. The French one, obviously. Nuclear energy is one of the few, or one of the secretary where France has a clear competitive advantage, and whatever it costs, they will continue with their nuclear energy policy. So, not even third or fourth generation reactors. But for geopolitical reasons, they also need to have a civil technology. The United States or the UK, those countries have a geopolitical incentive to continue with their nuclear program. Because I said before, the Russian case. Russia represents, I think it's 40% of the nuclear cycle on a world level. So technology, the nuclear technology in the future, when I'm talking about the civil, is a problem. Take into account the China too. So extending the life of the power plants, that's a completely different story. Extending lifespan has two advantages. One, you have to take into account not the cost of what has been invested, but also the cost of the new investments and also the variable cost, which is around this 20 megawatts hour with the new investments to extend the power plants 40 or 60 years, which means it's going to cost 35 euros megawatt hour. You know, this is what the European Nuclear Agency, with that price, it is competitive with renewables, even though they don't include the complementary costs, which the renewables say when we have this backup policy. But if the nuclear energy is removed sooner than expected, so from the standpoint strictly related to the environment, which is what the European Union has claimed, if we want to reduce the gas dependency, let's not put an end to the nuclear power plants. Personally, I think the nuclear policy is a complete disaster because all they're doing is increasing gas and coal consumption. And that's what Merkel did in her time. But when we're talking about the environment and a cost, I really don't think it is an alternative. So therefore, I think we have to reassess. And in fact, in the United States, 93 second-generation nuclear power plants, or I think there's 88, have a license to extend 40 or 60 years, and so, or even some 80 years. So the Americans, have they gone crazy? So this is something that is going to be open to debate, especially if we want to reduce the thermal space of a thermal gap, minimize the dependency on gas and fossil fuels. It's true to say that in 10, 15 years, we're able to have extra storage that doesn't need gas, like batteries, increase the hydroelectric that's pumped that's not going to have any effect on the thermal gap. So in 10 years' time, I think that the storage without hydrocarbons and without gas will exist. When I talk about storage, I'm talking as a backup technology for storage that isn't based on gas. Don't think it can exist. That's my personal opinion on this debate, which has been started, and I'm sure it will continue in the future. And I think that Germany said that they had to close 2 or 3 nuclear power plants before the end of this year, but I think they're still going to close them. So the Germans have paid no attention whatsoever to what the European Union has said.
¿Perdón?
10 segundos.
Sí,
para
sí, por
complementar
supuesto.
May I say something? The carbon footprint of kilowatt from nuclear plant is the lowest of all the renewable technologies, except for hydropower. So in terms of manufacturing hydrogen with low emissions, CO2 emissions, then we'll need to take into account nuclear plant. We continue. Vice Admiral? You can answer quickly if you want. Do you have questions about how the situation of the current conflict would affect the situation in the Arctic?
Ártico.
China's expansion in the Sea of China, artificial islands, etc. Maybe it could generate conflicts in the short and mid-term that could affect the choke points in the future. Thank you very much. I can answer both, right? Well, about the Arctic, in my opinion, it's clear. I'm no scientist. I don't know at what speed it is melting, but it's true that the coast of Russia, from Siberia to the Pacific, you can navigate. And Russia's done 3 things there. It has organized 2 cities that's created from the nothingness, we could say, focused on trying to give an alternative exit to gas and other materials. One of them is the city of Sabeta, where they have a liquefied gas production plant, where we have tankers that go straight to China through the Arctic. The alternative to this, what would it be? To go through the Baltic, go to Iran Bell, the English Channel, then the Atlantic, then the Suez, and then the Malacca Strait to get to China. So basically, from a strategic perspective, it's very important. And everyone probably remembers that a year and so ago, I can't remember exactly when, Russia presented a floating nuclear plant that's been taken to the Arctic, to a city called Kerkech, if I'm not wrong, which is an old gulag. So there we are seeing the extraction that we had before, also via direct transport to China. And we have to remember that China is the largest consumer of cereal, but also the largest importer, and it received the imports from Russia and the Ukraine. So once again, through the Turkish Straits, the Suez Channel, the Bab-el-Mandeb Channel, and the Malacca Strait. So that way that may seem efficient from a strategic perspective for Russia and China, it could be very interesting. Before we spoke about rare lands. Well, we have rare minerals productions in China and also in the US. So there could be a return transit of other raw materials. And regarding the specific, well, China does 2 things. China is occupying the sea. By fact, it occupies islands and extends it with artificial construction. Then it says they are on their own and they can create exclusive zones. And then there are some of them that are militarized. Then the fishing fleet of China. China is not very present in the Chinese Sea and the Pacific Ocean. Maybe they go to the south and they occupy territories of other fleets, which is what they're doing in West Africa, for instance, from Mauritania. And then we also have an expansion that is taking place via infrastructures, as they're doing in Africa. They finance infrastructures in countries of low income that cannot pay back. For instance, what's happening in Burundi. And so they keep their position there. And then through defense agreements, 3-4 weeks ago, they reached an agreement with the Solomon Islands, which are where the Marshall Islands are and New Guinea. And they have reached a defense agreement that allows China to defend the Solomon Islands from any rival. So that is also an area for them to grow. So yes, the answer is yes. I think that the conflict created by the expansion of China in the Chinese Sea, in the Sea of China, is going towards the south, towards the Indian Ocean, and also towards the Africa. And they've had, in fact, a special landing in Bata in Guinea. So this is something, and that's why they are doing things. Well, they're telling me that we have to finish. I'm really sorry some questions were left unanswered, but I would really like to thank you for your participation and for the questions that you've sent us. Thank you very much.
Bueno, muchas gracias.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you, Claudio, and the authors of the year, Jennifer Winter, Alonso, Alberto Villanos, represented by Carlos Machado, Vicente Cortez, and Benito Navarrete. Thank you all very much for coming today to this event, face-to-face, but also following us online. Please remember that you can download a PDF copy of the book on the Energy Club website. There's also some copies outside. And I would like to thank everyone that's made it possible for this event year after year and the different institutions that collaborate. I would also like to thank Colonel Felipe Sanchez Tapia from the Strategic Studies Center, also Igual Chakur and Diego de la Vega from Repsol. And to all of you, I hope you've enjoyed the event and we'll see you next year. Thank you very much.
Un placer.